Hey everyone, so we're going to be back in Fred again, and this time we're going to look a little bit at GDP. So, GDP, real simple, is just a measure of total production. But when we Google GDP in Fred, it's going to be a mess. So, there's two GDP terms that come up off the bat. One is called real gross domestic product, and one is called gross domestic product. One of the things that's important when we look at GDP over time, we always go to the word real. Sometimes it might say constant. This just means we've controlled for price levels. Again, this is going to be an important distinction when I look at nominal GDP and real GDP. So both these are essentially the same variable. This says billions of change 2012 dollars. So that means we're using the 2012 price level as the fixed prices. So it allows us just to compare production over time. We're actually going to open both these right now as just a comparison, and I'll show you what I mean. So I'm going to take this series, it's just GDP. I'm going to copy it in over here to the Fred graph and add line and just embed GDP in here. Oop, not real, just normal. And hit search, and there we go. So one thing you'll notice is, notice they're going to be exactly equal right here in 2012. If I had annual data, they'd be equal. You can see they're really, really close here, right? And you can see here in the second quarter, it kind of switches where the blue line becomes greater than the red line, or the red line becomes greater than the blue line. And that's because if we use 2012 as the price level, typically over time prices have gone up. So one of the reasons why the red line is growing faster than the blue line is because it's capturing both the increase in production and the increase in price level. Down here, what I'm doing is I'm sort of inflating the blue line using higher prices than we actually observed in that period. So this is when we look at nominal and real GDP, it's important over time to look at real GDP. When we go into the graph, we're going to edit, and we're going to do percent change from a year ago. This gives us economic growth. This is the rate of change. And you'll notice that the red line's far greater than the blue line. And in fact, you'll notice in some instances right here in the 1980s that the blue line was negative while the red line stayed positive. That reflects the fact that the early 80s was a period of oil shocks. Oil prices went up significantly, putting the economy into a recession. It's one of the main drivers of the business cycle. The first main driver is spending. Second main driver is what we call supply side shocks, things like commodity prices, labor costs, oil, labor costs, commodity prices with oil, labor costs with wages, and weather related events. But going back to the 1980s, what you'll notice really quickly is the red line, which is nominal GDP, was still saying we were growing at 3.2%. But in real terms, once we controlled for that price change, it was negative 2.5%. A lot of times you can see here in the Great Recession, both these moved pretty closely together. It was largely a demand side shock. We didn't have price shocks with it. So typically when we look at economic growth, the discussion is the blue line. What you'll notice is over time, there were a lot of periods back in the 60s and 70s where there was close to 5% economic growth, whereas that's become a much harder number to achieve, even in the early 2000s, in which everyone talked about, oh, we're going to have 4% economic growth. You can see here that rarely happened, right? Even 3% would be a good number, right? In fact, the last time we had a 4% growth rate was way back here and kind of bumped up to almost 4% in the first quarter of 2015. It looks like we were close to 4% over there in the second quarter of 2004. So that 4% number is a hard number to hit. Typically, we like to average right around 2 to 2.5% of real GDP growth. This graph also does a good job of highlighting why it's not a great measure of the business cycle. You can see here that in terms of the business cycle, it only captures data kind of at a quarterly lag. So it's not very good to use for a policy measure, as it's kind of slow capturing that data. But again, when we look at economic growth, we use real GDP. It controls for those price level changes relative to nominal GDP. I have a whole bunch of discussion board posts for you guys on what GDP does and does not calculate. Here, I just want to get you comfortable with analyzing the GDP data. Okay, so that's the first part of GDP. Now I'm going to go back here to these release tables, because one of the things I talked about were ways we measure GDP. So if we just go to real GDP quarterly and click on it, this breaks down the components. So I'm going to close up some of these windows, and you can see here that we measure GDP through 4 components: household spending, private domestic investment. When we say investment, we're not talking about financial investment in stocks and bonds. We're talking about investments into buildings and machinery. Net exports, exports are goods we sell to the rest of the world. Imports are goods we buy. So we net those out, and then we have government expenditures right here. It's important to recognize imports. These get subtracted out because it was goods not made in the US, but really they get subtracted out of consumption because we've already counted them at the household level. So when you go buy a pair of shoes that was made in Vietnam or China or Indonesia, it shows up in consumption, so we have to back it out because that wasn't done using US resources. You can really quickly see here consumption is by far the biggest component of GDP. It is usually about 2/3 of GDP. So one thing we can do real quick is just select exports, imports, and government. And I can hit add to graph, and it will include, these are real components, all these variables in the graph. So you can see how they've changed over time, right? Edit graph. I'm going to go to my imports, which looks like to be line 3 here. And I'm going to make this negative since we subtracted out, and hit apply. We can manipulate that. So there is your imports. Because I'm going to go to format. I want to go to, I like the area, it makes it look pretty, but then I want to stack by percent. Actually, let's just, I want to kind of clear this up, clean this up a little. I'm going to get rid of, I'm going to go back here to my release tables really quick. And I'm going to just do, the nice thing of this is if you make a mistake, it's really easy to go back. I didn't really make a mistake. I just want to make sure net exports of goods and services. There we go. And then go back to the stacking component, format, line, area, stacking percent. And a little bit better. I'm going to go and actually, you can see here we're a little bit, because of that negative mark, right? Net exports contributes about 4% of GDP. Again, there's that 2/3 number of consumption. Both investment and government expenditures are about 30%. One of the things that always surprises students is the government expenditure number being only 3.3 trillion. The perception is much higher. One thing that's important when we talk about government expenditures, it doesn't include transfer payments. So money spent to hospitals for Medicare or transferred through Social Security doesn't show up in these components. What shows up is when the people that get that money choose to spend it. So that's an important distinction. But again, so this is how you would create sort of a component, looking at the components of GDP. Again, going back to those release tables, there's lots of things we can do here. If you want to look at the breakdown of consumption goods, durable, non-durable services, even investment, there is what we call fixed investment. So this is non-residential for firms, structures, equipment, intellectual property products. And then residential, this is new housing. New single multifamily housing shows up in investment. Change in private inventories is worth talking about because every year we produce stuff that isn't sold. So we show it in private inventories. If all of a sudden private inventories are growing, it means we've made a lot of stuff that hasn't been sold yet. That's not necessarily a good thing. If private inventories are diminishing, it means we're selling things out of the warehouses and we might need to raise production to replenish those goods and goods that we've sold. Exports, imports, pretty straightforward. And government, federal, you can see a big chunk of this is defense. Here's your non-defense budget. And then state and local, these are going to be your schools, highways, roads, all of those things that state and local, fire, police, education show up in terms of where tax dollars go. So this gives you a little bit of breakdown of the expenditure approach of GDP. Going back here to these sections, because one of the tables I really like is this one, contributions. So this shows us what is driving changes in the business cycle. So in the first quarter, we can see that the GDP fell by about 5%. The biggest reason is that personal consumption contributed to almost all of that decline, the fall in personal consumption. Private investment fell a little bit. You'll see here government popped up a little bit as well. And so it breaks down, hey, we fell 5%. So the question is why? What were the main factors that contributed to that fall? Typically across the business cycle, I'm going to select each of these main categories again. Typically across the business cycle, what components change is, and I know it looks really, really noisy, so let's just clean it up a little bit. Rarely is consumption the main driver of the decline. Notice this blue line rarely ever falls. In the 2001 recession, it stayed positive. Go back even further, rarely does it go down. The main driver of the business cycles is almost always investment. Obviously, with the pandemic, shutting down so many businesses, the primary effect here was on investment or on consumption first and foremost. So a little bit of a unique change there.